Water shapes everything in our lives, from how we use our land, how we supply ourselves, and how we build for the future. The lack of water, or drought, is a force that reveals aspects of our lives that we often miss. Pressure points in our infrastructure, inequalities in our community, and the shifting boundaries of how we live. We've talked a lot about climate change, but today we're focusing on one of its manifestations worldwide: drought. From megadroughts in East Africa to shrinking reservoirs in Texas, drought is both a local crisis and a planetary problem. Here in Texas, it's especially urgent. So today, we're exploring drought from two perspectives: a global overview and specific stakes here in Texas. Specifically, we're exploring how these environmental pressures in Texas fit into the broader global narrative, and why paying attention to both matters now more than ever. I'm Nomin Rentsendorj, a student researcher at Rice University for Gulf Streams, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. For our first conversation, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. John Nielsen-Gammon, the Texas State Climatologist and the director of the Southern Regional Climate Center. He's a distinguished scholar with research expertise in various types of extreme weather, from droughts to floods, and as Texas State Climatologist, he helps the state of Texas make the best use of weather and climate information. Let's now jump into our conversation, where we discuss the state of drought in Texas. Okay, so Dr. Nielsen-Gammon, as a Texas State climatologist, I'm sure that you're well aware of the current drought conditions that we're going through in Texas right now. Can you give us a little bit of an insight on how these current drought conditions compare to historical patterns? And what do you think is contributing to these unexpected loads that we're seeing?
Well, right now we've got extreme drought in parts of South Central Texas and exceptional drought in West Texas, although depending on how you look at it, things are pretty bad in South Central Texas as well. Some of the reservoir levels from the San Antonio area in the south are at their historic lowest values. In West Texas, they don't, particularly the Trans-Pecos region, which is having the difficulty, they don't have reservoirs, but their ranchers are having to sell cattle and reduce operations because there's been several years without adequate rainfall. Other parts of the state are dry on shorter time scales, and about half the state's doing okay, I think. The main factor that affects weather on a large scale from year to year is El Nino and La Nina. El Nino, when the tropical Pacific temperatures are unusually warm, and La Nina when they're unusually cold. And this winter we've got a weak La Nina, which means the tropics are kind of cold, the jet stream's kind of weak, it's farther north than usual, and that tends to lead to less precipitation along the southern United States, at least parts of it. That doesn't, and 4 out of the last 5 years have had La Ninas during the winter time. We had an El Nino last year, but things weren't especially wet during that, so it didn't produce a lot of drought relief. But there's no particular climatological reason I know of why drought is severe in those particular parts of Texas. It's a matter of, individual storm systems, weather events don't affect the entire state at once. They're affecting parts of the state, and some places get lucky with a few storms, and other places miss out. And I think that's the story of why those particular parts of Texas are dry right now. And we have La Nina now that's expected to weaken over the next couple of months and go to what we call neutral conditions, where temperatures are pretty close to normal in the tropical Pacific. As we get farther into the spring and summer, El Nino and La Nina have less effect on our weather from day to day anyhow, because we get less influence from the jet stream, which is what's connecting El Nino and La Nina to our weather. In the summer, there's sort of a different potential influence because La Nina can potentially increase the number of hurricanes that form in the tropical Pacific probably was a contributing factor to the late season high number of hurricanes we had this past year. Um, it's difficult, it turns out, to predict El Nino and La Nina into the summer and fall. But once you get past the spring, it's a little we have a little bit more skill in being able to do that. At the moment, the odds slightly favor having a second year of La Nina, but it's really too early to be sure about that.
Okay, thank you. And in your previous response, you also mentioned how there are aquifers kind of at risk. For example, with aquifers such as the Edwards Aquifer near San Antonio, or near record lows this year, how dire do you think the current situation is? And do you think the immediate consequences for both the environment surrounding it, but also for the human population that relies on it?
Well, this time of year, water use is not very high. Big drivers of water use, especially groundwater, is agriculture. So that's presently not drawing water out of the system. For urban water use, gardens are account for a large part of the fluctuation of water use from winter to summer. So fortunately, right now we're in a low water use period. And as we get into April and May, usually rainfall amounts increase. But they better, because if it's this low in the summertime, there's going to be serious water restrictions in place. Um, the impacts the impacts are probably larger or potentially larger with smaller water suppliers. A utility like the San Antonio Water Service SAWS has backup water supplies. They've been pumping water underground to store it, and they also tapped into underground sources elsewhere in the state of Texas. So they're not tied to drought in that their particular backyard, but other suppliers potentially are. There were places in the southern part of the hill country a year or two ago that basically were running out of water or ran out of water and had to build emergency wells or have water piped in. If we don't have a decent spring for rainfall, we'll probably see more of that this summer.
Yeah, and with groundwater pumping, there's a risk of overuse. Do you think that Texas as a state should impose stricter regulations on groundwater? And what challenges do you think might come with implementing policies around groundwater?
One of the big challenges with dealing with groundwater is how different the various aquifers are. With a reservoir, you've got water sitting above the ground, and the only thing that really matters is how rapidly it evaporates, is the different and how much rain there is. But um, aquifers can be quite different. The Edwards Aquifer is basically a below ground reservoir. Water drains into it directly from streams in the recharge zone, and its levels fluctuate fairly rapidly. Most other aquifers, they're slower to recharge and slower to deplete as well. So some of the challenges with utilizing groundwater can be basically the inability to extract it rapidly enough to meet demand during a high demand period in the middle of a drought. You go farther west, you start running into places where the water is being pumped much faster than it can be replenished. So it's being treated more as a limited resource that can be utilized temporarily rather than something permanently. Um, the state doesn't really yeah have strict regulations like groundwater compared to surface water. It's a bit bizarre. They treat groundwater as almost a different substance than surface water. Groundwater is sort of like oil. If you find it under your ground, you can use it. And different regions, localities within the state may or may not have a management district that attempts to regulate its use and plan for sustained use for the future. And oftentimes those districts don't have much in the way of funding either to be able to enforce rules and so forth. So it's still a relatively unregulated um, circumstance. And one of the Supreme Court cases that established groundwater law in Texas basically said that groundwater is so complicated we really can't develop regulations to deal with it. But we've gotten a lot better at that in terms of understanding how water underneath the ground behaves and how it's connected with surface water. So I think there is some room for more coordination, but it runs up against the fact that groundwater is something is private property, and Texas tends to not like public regulation of private property.
Moving on to the topic of broadly water infrastructure, Texas is expected to spend almost 154 billion in investments over the next 50 years, going towards this water infrastructure, of which 95 billion is expected to go towards repairing drinking water and wastewater systems. What do you think are the most urgent infrastructural improvements that Texas might need in order to handle the increasing drought conditions?
You got those numbers from the state water plan, I presume?
Yes.
Yeah, so those are plans. Um, and there is money available for water infrastructure, but the way it's set up, if you want to get money from the state for water infrastructure locally, you better have it in your plan that it's important to have it. So I think there's much more infrastructure in the plans than will actually ever be put in place. We're still talking billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, though. The uh, as far as what the best projects to spend it on are, we've pretty much gone away from a lot more surface water storage. We've run out of to some extent good locations, and population has filled in places that would have been potentially good sites if people weren't already living there and using them for other purposes. Um, the there are certainly a lot of groundwater resources that aren't heavily utilized because they're expensive to use. They have dissolved solids in them, salts and so forth, so they're brackish and uh, they need to be purified. Not as much as you have to purify seawater, but still they require treatment. So it becomes a matter of how much people are willing to pay for water. A challenge with developing water infrastructure is that the cheapest sort of solution is conserving water, not using as much, which is great, except it's not something that you can get funding for very, very readily. At least it's not the sort of project that people tend to latch on to. So the projects for conserving water are somewhat underutilized or underfunded compared to what could be done beneficially. And one problem with conservation as a solution is it's the incentives are counterproductive for a water utility because it gets its money from selling water to customers. And so while they don't want to spend a lot of money on big infrastructure projects, you don't want to have customers using less water than is necessary to sustain the operations in the first place. So there's all sorts of issues like that complicate the picture.
I see. Another question I want to ask, tangentially related to the infrastructure side. Here in Houston, we have lost over 36 billion gallons of water in the past 2 years due to leaky pipes. How significant do you think water losses from, I guess, outdated infrastructure in Texas? What steps do you think that places in Texas can kind of take to address the issue of outdated infrastructure?
Yeah, water loss from leaky pipes is a huge problem across Texas. It's a lot easier to build the infrastructure than to replace it. Unfortunately, it's you're putting in a road. You can put in a pipe before you pave it over, and it's relatively easy. You don't have to worry about digging up just a narrow swath. So it becomes a lot more expensive after the fact, and plus the infrastructure could be borne development by the cost of the developer, whereas repair and replacement is a cost borne by the utility. So Texas has the benefit of being a relatively youthful state, let's say, compared to places in the Northeast or Midwest where a good portion of the infrastructure. It can be 100 years old or more, but still it's going to be a growing problem. And yeah, it's not really an easy thing to deal with. You can put in building codes requirements for the quality of pipes to be superior than they were in the past, but that only pays dividends 50 or 75 years from now, and it doesn't solve the existing problems. So it would be nice if we could, if there were good technological solutions, like being able to essentially put pipes within pipes or reinforce them before a leak develops so that water's not lost in that fashion. But there's so much, so much of our infrastructure is underground. You just can't see what's happening. You can run a camera through a pipe and take a look at stuff, but unfortunately, we've got a lot of soils that expand and contract, and they do a number on water pipes.
Speaking of technological improvements, do you think that there are any technologies that might be promising in drought mitigation here in Texas?
Well, there are a lot of strategies being employed that sort of nibble at the problem. It's too big a problem that there's not going to be one big solution. One strategy being employed is potable reuse, where you take water that's been used and has gone through treatment and then used again if it's been treated adequately, or has otherwise is not going directly back to human use necessarily, but is being filtered by the natural system. That can be a good way of increasing the amount of water available without increasing the amount of water. And we actually do that already, in the sense that Houston is downstream of the Trinity River from Dallas-Fort Worth, and a lot of what comes out of Dallas-Fort Worth is treated wastewater going into the Trinity River. But by the time it makes it down to Houston, it's nature has cleaned it up, and so Houstonians don't have a problem with drinking Dallas wastewater unless they think about it.
Thanks, Dr. Nielsen-Gammon, for the very insightful conversation. Next, for our second conversation, I was delighted to interview Dr. Chris Funk, professor and director of the Climate Hazards Center at UC Santa Barbara. His research expertise includes studying climate and climate change and developing improved data and monitoring/prediction systems. You can check out his book, Drought, Flood, Fire: How Climate Change Contributes to Catastrophes, or his other book, Drought, Early Warning and Forecasting, Theory and Practice, most of which is copyright-free on his website if you're interested in learning more. Let's get started.
Okay, Dr. Funk. So the first question I have is, with the scope of your work focusing on the relationship between climate change and extreme weather events, how does climate change intensify drought conditions globally?
Oh, yes, that's a great question, Nomin. There are, several ways that it is amplifying the intensity of droughts. And the one that is, by far the most accepted and the best understood is just the idea that, warmer air holds more water vapor. And so its ability to suck moisture out of crops and rangelands goes up as temperatures go up. So, when we have rainfall deficits and, moisture stress, that moisture stress is amplified by, warmer temperatures. And if you think about how the leaf of a plant works, basically, it has this fundamental challenge that it has to suck in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to fuel photosynthesis, which produces sugars, hydrates. But every time it opens these little doors in its leaves called stomates to pull in carbon dioxide, water vapor escapes. So, that's called transpiration. So there's a trade-off between transpiration and, carbon sequestration in photosynthesis. And as temperatures go up and essentially the relative humidity of the air goes down, when those little doors open, the plants lose more water vapor. And so this is can be a really big problem, um, both for crops like corn, but also, pasture lands that feed cattle.
What regions would you say are currently the most affected by these drought conditions? And why do you think that is?
Yeah. So, and you could think about both, kind of regions and seasons. And, essentially, there's two sort of offsetting tendencies with climate change, um, both related to the fact that hotter air holds more water. And so, in places that are really humid, right, there is the atmosphere heats up, then the air holds more water vapor, and that translates into things like more extreme rainfall events, potentially flooding, also things like humid heat risks. So where it's really really hot and it's also really really humid, those are really dangerous conditions. But those places aren't so much at risk for drought. But if you, on the other hand, are in a really dry place or a really dry part of the season where there's not much water vapor in the air, then as the temperature goes up, this plant stress associated with really high temperatures goes up really quickly. So, Texas has a lot of places like this. So we're seeing, big impacts on a lot of rangelands in particular, are really affected a lot by that.
Can you kind of describe why, as a climate data expert such as yourself, can you kind of explain why climate data is so important for drought monitoring and monitoring these conditions?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, we're part of, early warning systems that want to trigger responses to droughts. And so, we're basically experts, at detecting droughts and making, authoritative statements. Like, for example, a good one came from Southern Africa, which in 2024 had a really devastating drought caused by an El Nino event, which is associated with really warm waters in the Eastern Pacific and a really terrible um, heat wave. And so, our rainfall data, was used to make a statement. You know, uh, Central Southern Africa had the driest rainy season in the last at least 100 years. So you're trying to take this extreme event and put it in historical context so that you can trigger responses to droughts. That's really important, and you have to have climate data to do that. You can't just have satellite observations from last month, or something fancy. You have to have a context. And in Texas, and the rest of the United States, uh, we have really fantastic um, drought monitoring capabilities hosted by the National Drought Monitoring Center, and those feed into crop insurance um, programs provided by the federal government that are a critical safety net, to farmers in every county in the United States. And so those are critical.
Kind of looking at the broader scale globally, how would you say that the landscape has changed over time, over the past few decades? What do you think is driving these changes that we're seeing?
Yeah, well, one that we've already talked about, and we could maybe move on to something else, but obviously hotter air temperatures, desiccation associated with that, is something that pretty much everybody knows about. But interestingly enough, there's a big connection between drought in Texas and drought in East Africa. where I focus a lot of my attention. And that connection is what's called a La Nina event, and a big scale circulation feature called the water circulation. And so, if we think about the Pacific Ocean, under normal conditions, there are trade winds that blow from the Eastern Pacific into the area around Indonesia and converge there and produce lots of rainfall in that area. And then that rainfall releases a lot of heat into the atmosphere, and that energy goes up into the troposphere and then ends up sinking down over what are called the subtropical highs, which includes a lot of Texas, and over East Africa, places like Kenya. And that's part of the reason why East Africa and Texas just dry on average, right? They're sort of on the receiving end of this energy that is sinking down over Texas and places like Kenya. And that's kind of normal condition. So from year to year, there are variations in Pacific sea surface temperatures. This is kind of the area south of Hawaii by the equator. And when that region is hotter than normal, we have what's called a La Nina event. And that tends to bring above normal precipitation to Texas and East Africa. And when those ocean waters are cooler than normal, we have a La Nina event, which tends to produce drought over East Africa, Texas. But what's been happening over time is first that we've just had many La Nina events over the last several years. So La Nina event 2017, 2020, 21, 21, 22, 22, 23, and now we've just and now we've just entered another one in 2025. So that's what used to kind of be a 1 in 5 year event seems to be much more. And furthermore, when those events happen and you have cooler than normal sea surface temperatures south of Hawaii, you also have much warmer than normal sea surface temperatures in the Western Pacific. And so the overall gradient in those sea surface temperatures is going up. And, that basically produces a stronger La Nina response. And so I know for sure that affects East Africa with really, devastating drought impacts. And I would suspect that you have a similar relationship in Texas, because there's a similar in southern Texas. So it's kind of the more southerly parts of the state.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you kind of touched on, how these impact drought and kind of drought cycles worldwide, of course, in East Africa, as you mentioned, and here in Texas. Can you kind of expand on, apart from the causes of drought, climate change exacerbating it, of course, the things you mentioned earlier, can you kind of expand on how important it is to detect droughts early, and kind of what kind of advances are being made in this field, if there are any?
Yeah, that's a great question. Or even predict droughts. So, so one of the things that that we've developed over the years to support famine early warning, right, is the kind of concept and implementation of kind of integrated drought forecasting and monitoring system. And basically, what we can do many months ahead of the time is use forecasts of sea surface temperatures to anticipate these kind of supercharged La Nina related droughts, And that's kind of at a coarse spatial scale. We could map kind of historical impacts in Texas of those droughts. And then, as we get into the rainy season, we can then use, high resolution weather forecasts to anticipate droughts, maybe on a 1 to 30-day time scale. And then as we get into the season, we can use really high quality observations of rainfall to start tracking the drought. And we can also combine the observations and the forecasts to, kind of do an early detection of the drought. So it's often possible, when we're a third or halfway through the rainy season, that we can make statements like, there's a 80% chance that this is going to be a terrible rainy season, right? And so that triggers, earlier responses, and which can be really important in our work because we're trying to keep people from starving. So earlier response is better. So that's what we're doing here at the Climate Hazard Center, and it's it's really valuable and important work.
And can you kind of expand on that? I mean, people know, of course, like climate change and droughts, they have adverse impacts on the environment and people, but can you kind of expand on maybe what kinds of impacts we would see if there's prolonged droughts or more extreme droughts?
The impact of these increasing air temperatures and the desiccation on, plants, trees and shrubs, rangelands, is absolutely contributing to the fact that we have more frequent and extensive wildfires. That's just something that we're seeing a lot of. And, we're also seeing these wildfires happen kind of out of season, right? So we just had terrible wildfires in Los Angeles in January, which has never happened before. There were wildfires in outside of Boulder, Colorado in December a couple of years ago. I mean, so these are kind of unseasonal, but that's certainly having a big impact. And we're also seeing really devastating droughts in both Eastern Africa and then Southern Africa, that I discussed, that are really contributing to a lot of food insecurity. I think it's really important that people do not lose hope in the face of climate change, and maybe especially young people, and the one empowering perspective is to realize that climate extremes kind of happen one at a time, and each of those events is an opportunity for early warning and adaptation. So I think a good example where we've seen a huge amount of progress have been these atmospheric river flood events that are hitting the west coast of the United States, right? So these are, you got this kind of stream of water vapor that's, coming onshore in the western US, and they've gotten really good at predicting these and preparing. And so, that's just a good example of how we can do better. And examples of this in East Africa related to the droughts, is that we've been working really closely with the Kenya Meteorological Department, and working with them to develop these climate and weather forecasts and get the information communicated out, kind of at the county level or even the individual farm level, so that the farmers can adapt. And I'm not an adaptation specialist, but some of the kind of things that we've been involved in, is you can, at very long leads, you can pick a type of corn, for example, that matures more quickly, So maybe it only needs, 30 days of rain, not 60 days of rain. So it's, more drought resistant, or maybe you plant cassava or a different crop altogether that's not so thirsty. There are also, uh, things that farmers can do, like dig pits around the maize crops that capture moisture. These are called side pits. Um, the farmers can, uh, mix things into those pits that store water, so that like either um, vegetation matter or the stuff called biochar that absorbs the water and holds it. Um, and then finally they can use micro irrigation to help overcome some of the deficits. And then there are other things too, but that's just that stuff is we helped motivate some of those activities in during the droughts in like 2021 and 2022 in Kenya. And some of the farmers were able to have good harvests even though the rainfall deficits were pretty severe. So there's definitely a lot that can be done.
But are there any emerging technologies or research that you found that might offer hope for people in mitigating these kind of extreme weather patterns, especially extreme drought impacts?
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of exciting new technologies that kind of across the board. We're seeing a lot of improvements in weather and climate forecasting. Some of the machine learning and AI stuff looks very promising and exciting. We're seeing a big increase in the amount of satellite information that we have to monitor conditions, and that's really exciting. We're seeing exciting new automatic weather stations that can be used to track precipitation and temperature without having to have somebody there with a rain gauge. Um, and I think maybe some of the most important are innovations in I guess what I call humanitarian intelligence, which is you know human experts working together to solve problems. And so this could be uh, somebody from the Climate Hazard Center working with somebody in Kenya who is an agricultural expert, working with somebody who is a kind of media outreach expert. Like there's this neat group called Shamba Shape Up that makes videos that they can send out to farmers, SMS messages, and so you put together all these pieces, and you can have really effective early warning, proactive action. I think if um, there's going to be successful adaptation to these climate and weather extremes in many places, but maybe especially like the developing countries, I think they are going to leverage the effective use of social media and digital telecommunications like that. Because uh, by working together, we can kind of take some of these cutting edge forecasts or climate observations, that might be produced here at the Climate Hazard Center or someplace that's really technologically developed, and then that can be shared, with partners, in a country like Guatemala or Zimbabwe or Kenya, and then contextualized, for their needs, and then shared out to potentially millions of people to help them, anticipate weather and climate shocks and prepare. And that's already happening. So it's we're not just making this up. It just needs to be scaled up so that it can reach millions. So there's, this La Canicula in Guatemala in this sort of dry corridor that has a high frequency of kind of mid-season droughts, right? And, if you, are expecting that and get a decent forecast about that, then maybe as a farmer, you can, do some micro irrigation or, soil water retention practices, things like that, to kind of make it through that dry spell and come out the other side. So that's a great example, yeah.
A big thanks to Dr. Funk for a wonderful conversation. This concludes our segment around drought. Now, let's hear from Sophia Soltes, a fellow student researcher, for her newest Critter Corner segment.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and welcome back to Critter Corner, where we dive into Houston's fascinating wildlife. In each episode, we feature experts and enthusiasts who share their favorite local flora and fauna, the role in our ecosystem, and ways that we can all support our community's biodiversity. In this episode, we're joined by Carla Clay, the founding director of Artist Boat with over 30 years of experience in arts and environmental education, and who led the way to conserve over 1,000 acres on Galveston Island. Welcome to the show, Carla.
Hi, thank you, Sophie.
Of course. So to start off, can you tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
I'm Carla Clay. I'm the executive director of the Artist Boat. At Artist Boat, we integrate art and science through 6 different programs to teach people about marine environments and coastal margins, from eco art kayak adventures to in-school residency programs. Everyone produces some kind of artwork to translate knowledge about the environment. They're as simple as little watercolors to like permanent murals or mosaics, or trash barrels on the beach that are painted with trash messages, things like that. My work is mostly as the executive director, fundraising, grant writing, and making sure we can pay all our bills, but also that we have the staff to deliver our programs.
Well, thank you for sharing about some of the fascinating work that you do, and I'm super excited to dive in with you today. So with that, can you tell us what species you're talking about today and why it's special to you?
My favorite animal that's not human that I've made friends with is a bottlenose dolphin. So I grew up in the Florida Keys. My dad was a shark biologist, and we had shark pens in the Gulf of Mexico, and he shipped sharks all around the world and kept them alive in captivity. And next door to us was Flipper Sea School, which is now the Dolphin Research Center. And so I've been friends with dolphins since I can remember anything. And they're very intelligent. They all have different personalities and likes and dislikes. And one dolphin, who is the star in the movie The Big Blue, Nachua, I was very close to my whole childhood. And when I was older, I went back and did a summer internship at the Dolphin Research Center, and Nachua always knew who I was, and everybody say, "Oh, Nachua has a great affinity towards you," which I already knew. But I think we learn a lot from other mammals and friendships with other species, because there are languages way older than words, and those languages are intuitive to all animals. But if you wanted to know about bottlenose dolphins, I could also tell you more about them as a being, like how they work and their senses and all of that.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that. And that sounds like a really special experience that you got to share. So I'm wondering, are bottlenose dolphins at all native to Galveston Bay or other close areas of the Gulf of Mexico?
Oh, yeah. So they're a very coastal species. Most of our bays on the Gulf of Mexico have a resident population of bottlenose dolphins. We also have populations of bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico. But for example, in Galveston Bay, I think over 3,000 individuals have been identified here after the oil spill in Barataria-Terrebonne estuary. There have been no successful live dolphin births because of all the damage done to the population from the oil spill. And people think, why don't they leave? It's polluted, but they grew up there. That's their home. And they know that the bottlenose dolphins of different bays are very faithful to those bays. So like Tampa Bay has a population. We have a population here. Down in Corpus, Aransas Pass has a population. And they live in matriarchal family groups. And the boys disperse when they get older and have to find a new family to hang out with.
What role does the bottlenose dolphin play in Galveston Bay's ecosystem, as well as the many other areas then that they can be found?
Well, the bottlenose dolphin is a top predator, so they can eat what they want. They also need a lot of food, so they probably might be perceived by fishermen to compete for food. But they're definitely a top predator, eating fish in quite an abundant amount. Of course, they're also very good for tourism because you can sustain a dolphin watch vessel and people will pay to go see the dolphins in the ship channel or wherever. Well, they see them in the ship channel. Here is the best place to see them.
Yeah, and you've already shared a lot of interesting facts about this species, but what is one extra surprising fact about the bottlenose dolphin that you especially find interesting and that people might not know?
Oh, well, I think they're fascinating. One, they're conscious breathers. All marine mammals have to decide when to take a breath. So I always tell people, imagine if every time you just needed to breathe, you had to decide to breathe. That's a lot of attention to pay attention to yourself to breathe. So they have to be very smart. Also, with their sonar, they can send, scientists believe that they sonar something, they send out sound, they get an image back. Now, it won't be the image like we see in our eyes. And that image, they suspect that they can send it to another bottlenose dolphin. So it would be like I went to the restaurant and was like, hey, Sophie, look at my lasagna. And I sent you mentally an image of my lasagna. And then you'd be like, hey, I want to go to that restaurant. So they're conveying a lot of knowledge through their sonar to each other about the environment. And then they can stun fish with the sonar. And then also they have what's called a click train, a whistle. So they each have a name and they know each other's names and can tell each other their names.
Wow, that's super interesting. Sounds like
Yeah.
a lot of research is being done on these bottlenose dolphins.
Oh,
And
more and more every day. Yeah.
yeah, which is great. And with that, I'm wondering what are some simple ways that people can support the species, either through funding research or through local initiatives or anything like that?
Well, they could donate money to the marine mammal stranding networks in their state. Like in Texas, we have the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network. So if a dolphin is injured, they respond. If a dolphin is dead, they take a necropsy, which gives us more information about what could be happening. Anything you can do to reduce sound in the water. Sound travels 7 times faster or 3 times faster in water than air. And so like any way you can reduce sound in the ocean helps all marine mammals. Also, we have to remember every chemical that we apply to our yard, to our gardens, runs off the land during a rain event, enters the water, enters the food web. And so they're finding a lot of PCBs and other chemicals and plastics, microplastics in the dolphins, which means they're ingesting it as the food travels up the food web, it bioaccumulates in the fish that the dolphins are eating. So any reduction in pollution is paramount to the health of marine mammals. And air quality is also important because when they breathe, they are exchanging a lot more air than we do because they pull in all the air, they go underwater and they hold their breath for a long time. So I can't remember the exact amount of exchange, but like a bird exchanges almost 100% of its air every time it breathes. A bottlenose dolphin, I don't remember the percent, but it's a lot more than we do because we can just breathe at our leisure. We don't have to think about it.
Thank you so much for sharing those tips and information about the bottlenose dolphin. I think a lot of the ways we can help are very easy and practical, but not everyone knows about them. So it's super important that you came on here and talked to us. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in and make sure to come back soon to learn more about these fascinating local species.
Thanks, Sophia. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Henriquez. Blue Viatoro. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jaden Bray Boyce, Sophia Soltesz, and Nomin Rentsendorj. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French, here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.